Okay, we're going to get started with the COVID inquiry, which kicked off yesterday. Here's Baroness Hallett, the lovely Baroness Hallett, of course, is chairing this. And the question is it fit for purpose? And in fact, actually, the better question is, what is its purpose? I'm sure Debbie's going to have a comment on this in a second. But the inquiry began with, what I can only describe as a piece of applied psychology, because Baroness Hallett made it clear that she was going to lead off with a piece of video, which many people would find extremely harrowing. But it's okay, she said, because they're going to show this warning that you can see on screen on the live stream. So you could pause the live stream or you could leave the room if you weren't prepared to watch it. So the video was some edits of various people talking about their experience of the COVID-19 pandemic, and inevitably they're talking about relatives and close loved ones who had passed away. So the video undoubtedly was very harrowing, and it was, I believe, designed to have a psychological effect on people watching. Now, I don't want to understate, of course, the personal tragedy for the people who believe that their loved ones died from a novel coronavirus, but I'm going to say that I certainly dispute that that's what they died of, because for me, for example, the ongoing excess mortality that we're seeing, nobody seems to be concerned about that. It's been fairly steady levels for the last 2 years. And bearing in mind that the 5-year average that we're measuring this excess mortality against is higher now, because it's taking into account 2022. It's taking into account the COVID-19 wave in 2021. So that even makes the situation worse. Nobody seems to be too worried about that. But of course, so we've got to ask, well, what was the reason for the mortality? Was it because of a novel coronavirus pandemic, or was it for other reasons? Well, I want to highlight this article from the UK column. It's called Exercise Cygnus, UK government exercise justifies COVID-19 lockdown. It's by Robin Kaiser. And just take a couple of quotes from this, because of course she was pointing out that in the years leading up to the so-called pandemic, already intensive care beds were being shut down. So she's saying here in 2016, the Royal College of Surgeons had complained of chronic bed shortages, so much that the occupancy rates had gone beyond 89%. So that's general hospital beds. She goes on to say that in 2018, the Faculty of Intensive Care Medicine astonishingly reported that across the UK, 80% of intensive care units were sending patients to other hospitals, either because of a lack of beds or a shortage of staff, particularly nurses. And to cap things off, she said that by 2019, it was being reported by the British Medical Association that ICU beds had begun to be used for patients recovering from routine operations, and that when more emergency beds were needed, a policy of escalation beds came into force. The BMA dryly reported that there was little sign of this practice ending. So, what the point that's being made here is that the evidence is showing that the NHS was already under massive stress before the headlines about an oncoming pandemic came along. And I'm going to suggest that, with the best will in the world, a certain proportion of the NHS probably panicked at the time. But it didn't end there, of course, because once the pandemic hit in anger, then what did they do? They started reorganizing the hospitals, pulling more beds out of the hospitals during that time, because they had to then impose a social distancing policy. So they were attempting to make sure that there was 2 meters between each bed and so on, and they reduced the number of beds even further. So coming back to the actual inquiry itself, here is the lead counsel to the inquiry, Hugo Keith, KC. He said this: you will hear evidence that for many years an influenza pandemic was assessed as being one of the most likely risks to the United Kingdom. He went on to say, but what about other risks that, whilst they might be less likely, could be just as if not more deadly. So he's suggesting that really, and this perhaps is the theme of the thing, the suggestion that really the UK government was only interested in an influenza pandemic, and that when something else came along, then they weren't prepared for it, they didn't know how to react to it, and so on. But actually, when we look at the preparations for this, and I mean the statement about being prepared for influenza pandemic is absolutely correct, because that was the scenario that they had been using for testing under Exercise Cygnus and other similar exercises. The actual plans that they had in place were exactly what were eventually rolled out during 2020 and 2021. So coming back to this article, again, I just wanted to highlight another quote from this. It says that following the publication of the 2011 preparedness paper, the number of ICU beds continued to fall. Then 5 years later, the government held an unusual and secretive event called Exercise Cygnus. It involved all government departments, all local authorities, the NHS, right across the UK. Its report has not been published for national security reasons, and so as not to frighten the public, despite the fact they then subsequently did go on to frighten the public through the Spy B proposals. However, according to those with first-hand knowledge of the operation, Cygnus script contained a scenario of a patent lack of capacity in ICU beds and personal protective equipment. So the scenario that was practiced during Exercise Cygnus was exactly the scenario that was rolled out during the COVID-19 pandemic. A shortage of ICU beds, a shortage of general beds, a shortage, if you remember, of personal protective equipment. This was the narrative that was being presented in the press at the time. And so that was prepared for. And if you think back to that article, it said all local authorities, all government departments, all NHS. So they knew what was, or how to deal, or you would think they knew how to deal with that situation. And yet, when the narrative came out in the media in early 2020, that was exactly the scenario that was presented to the public. Is the inquiry going to have a look at that? I don't think they are. They're clearly going to attempt to suggest that the government was only prepared for influenza, and when something else came along, it wasn't really prepared for it, and so it was making it up as they went along. Nothing could be further than the truth. They had rehearsed this in Exercise Cygnus, and they had it all down. Now, what's interesting, if we just put that back on screen for a second, that first link there, at the end of the sentence, it says, government held an unusual and secretive event called Exercise Cygnus. That, when I clicked on it this morning, when I was just taking these screenshots to show you, resulted in this. Because strangely enough, that particular document, which is the only official document that we know of that mentions this exercise, which was from the Wales NHS, one of the Wales NHS trusts, is no longer available. That's very strange. Well, let's just put it on screen. If we could just put that back up. So here it is. That is the document. The link has now been fixed because luckily the Wayback Machine still has a copy of it. So we have fixed that link if anybody wants to go and look at this document itself.
So lots of questions, Mike, over this whole thing. What was happening previously, excuse me, and what's actually happening in this so-called inquiry. A lot of work to be done.
100%. So Debbie, I don't know what your thoughts are on this. I mean, obviously it's only the first day of it. And we've had all the furore over the last couple of weeks about its access to various WhatsApp communications and so on. But I mean, what are your thoughts on where this is going?
Well, good afternoon. My personal thoughts are, number one, when it comes to Exercise Cygnus, let's not forget that was under Jeremy Hunt's watch. And there's also lots of other secret exercises that we haven't been told about that were within Cygnus, like Exercise Alice. It appears to me as though the inquiry is actually just an exercise to gather data to prepare for the next pandemic, but it's going to take so long. You know, we're looking at 6 modules already with more modules coming, and Sweden completed their inquiry in 1 year. To me, this is an exercise in itself, like SPA's pandemic 2025 to 2028, and it's purely to gather data, again, information data, and I worry that the inquiry is actually exploiting people's tragic stories and ignoring them, and that when the inquiry does eventually come out with information, we'll all be too old to remember what happened.
Okay, so we've got Professor Norman Fenton here.